Well, welcome to this episode of Think, Pare, Share here at Sharpstown High School. Today, we're really excited to have Nancy Motley as our guest. She is the author of Talk, Read, Talk, Write, a practical approach to learning in the secondary classroom. She is currently an educational consultant for Seidlitz Education. She is the parent of two daughters currently living in Houston, Texas. She's also the co-author of the Diverse Learner Flip book. In your previous roles, I think you've served as classroom teacher, reading specialist, interventionist, coordinator, professional development instructor, curriculum developer, and you currently hold a Master's of Arts in Counseling as well. I'm curious to know a little bit more about that. Is that something that you use regularly as you practice now?
Yeah, shockingly, I think that postgraduate work was the most useful for me out of anything I did in teaching, because it really just taught me to be a great listener and to just value the connection with kids before I even think about content. And so I thought I wanted to be a school counselor, and I never noticed in all those titles, I never executed that plan, but the learning certainly has served me well in my relationship building throughout my career. So
how does that manifest itself in like adult learning and professional development?
So I think just being vulnerable, being self-aware, and really listening to hear instead of listening to try to have my next thought communicated over whatever you just said. I know, oftentimes I go into an audience in August of required professional development, and that's not always the most engaging and excited audience, right? And so I think for anything I have to share with teachers to be heard, they have to know that I'm not a know-it-all, that I'm a realist, that I've spent time in their shoes, and so I've really worked to just be authentic in whatever I'm doing, whether it's with kids or with adults, and usually that comes through pretty clearly.
You did a Virtue L conference. You were the keynote speaker, and I heard you say at one point, you got to be the learning. And that reminded me of a book by Jeffrey Wilhelm, You Got to Be the Book. In that book, he talks a lot about just reflecting on his own experience as a reader, and over time, how it shaped the way that he taught struggling readers how to read. I'm interested in how you've used so many of your own life experiences to better your craft. In the book, you talk about just the conversation that you had with your husband about going over some insurance paperwork. Was there an experience in your life that impelled you to working with English language learners specifically?
The English language learner focus that I've had it for most of my career came by pretty organically, and it wasn't self-driven. In my second year of teaching, my principal, Volin, told me to go get certified. So that's what I did over the summer. Was I took some coursework. They had a changing and increasing EL population. And so I went and took the test. I'm a good test taker. I didn't really study. I took a little course, but anyway, I passed with flying colors. And the following year, two of my sections were full of largely beginner and early intermediate English language learners. And I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and again, I had good relationships with kids, but and so in my utter lack of knowledge about working with English learners at the time, I knew they needed to talk, right? So we talked a whole lot. The downside was I didn't really have a grasp on the sheltered strategies that I do now. So they were using the same 300 words in English that they came into my classroom with. And that was evidenced at the end of that year when we got their TELPAS scores back. I had maybe like 2 or 3 kids that had increased in proficiency, and everyone else had stagnated. And I would probably say that failure, this is the way I look at it on my part, really ignited my passion. I just felt like I'd failed those students and that they deserved better. And so from that moment on, I demanded that I got the English learners, and I did my due diligence at, doing the very best I could to educate myself, go to PDs, read books, sit in other teachers' classrooms. I became like a EL junkie, if you will, so that I could do exactly what I wanted to do, which was help all these students succeed in a place where at my own hand, they didn't my first year working with them.
I moved down here from Buffalo, New York. I took French in high school. And so when I moved to Houston and I started teaching in high school, thinking I'm going to teach literature, and quickly realized that I was going to be teaching reading and writing. And I think like you went through that same experience of, I got to figure out how to do this. And so I think that's interesting. At what point, for me, it was after about 3 years that I started to realize, I think I can do this. I think I might be able to do this. Like for you, when was that moment when you kind of realized, I got this?
I will tell you that, and I don't mean to be a bragger, but probably that third year, right? So my first year, I didn't work with English learners. My second year was awful. And by the end of the third year, we had kids who had skipped a level in proficiency. But like I said, I lived and breathed it. I mean, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. At the time, I didn't have a dog or a pet or a husband or anything, right? So I had the time to do that. And then from then, I get bored real easily. So when I felt like, okay, even though you have different kids every year, I kind of felt like, okay, I know how to shelter instruction really well. That's kind of when in my fourth and fifth year in my career is when I really focused on spreading the love. So I would do little mini PDs after school for my campus. And then that turned into some district professional development. But I'm always looking for a new challenge. And so that's kind of how I transitioned from just teaching to teaching adults and students to, obviously now in my career, authoring books and kind of learning new things all the time.
Has the experience of teaching adults and working with adults sharpened and made you a better teacher of young people?
I would say yes. And the reason for that is if you're in a classroom full of young people of any age, maybe in high school, they might voice their opinion, but a lot of times, what do? They'll just smile and nod. And adults are not that way. If you're not meeting the needs of an adult in a professional learning environment, you find that out pretty quickly. And so I've had to do a lot of navigating of that. Often I run across a situation that is something I don't have experience in, and I've got to be truthful about that. And then in a collaborative way, try to troubleshoot some of those challenges. A perfect example of that is I have not been a classroom teacher since COVID hit. So as a consultant, as an author, as a professional, I have been learning and working with teachers, but I can't say right now that I have stood in their shoes this year. I know that. So I'm doing a lot of asking questions. I'm doing a lot of conversations, but it's a lot less of me teaching something I know to you because you know more than I know in that regard.
I find myself in the same position sometimes, working with groups of teachers, like, you guys are in the work. I'm bringing to you a possible idea or something that we can, do to further our kids' progress, and let's see how it goes. Education Right. is sometimes such a grand experiment, especially now.
I have found in my work with teachers this year, continually falling back on best practices. I mean, good teaching is good teaching in any teaching and learning environment, right? And I think that centers us back to the book. Anytime kids are talking, reading, and writing, we are moving them forward with content and with language. That it doesn't, I don't have to learn 18 apps to try to figure this out in a virtual setting.
In your book, you talk about this idea of shortening the rope. You've got students in your classroom, and your role as the teacher is to not necessarily do the work for them, but reach down and bring them up to where you want them to be. Within our administrative team, because we plan to use this book for professional development next year, we were thinking about it. And can you clarify what shortening the rope means and what its implications for practical implementation of the talk, read, talk, write?
Really, shortening the rope, this whole analogy that's at the front of the book is really just about what's the right appropriate amount of scaffolds or supports for kids who are not immediately successful. And obviously in your case, this is your lens is often your English learners, but it really works for any kind of learner in your building. Early in my career, I knew my babies who needed help, and I gave them all the help in the world. I was like the mother hen, especially my English learners, because it was almost like no one else in the building cared about them but me. So I felt very protective of them and making sure all of their accommodations are in place. But the reality was I was coming from a place of love, but I was over supporting them. They weren't moving forward. They were happy and they loved to come to my class, but they weren't succeeding.
You're the ultimate mother hen. You're around, you're making sure they're where they're supposed to be. And yeah.
and then there's the other type of teacher, right? Sink or swim. This is biology. You got to pass it. I'm not doing all this stuff because, this is the grade level standard, right? So there's middle ground in between. And kind of my lens for shortening the rope is what is the end goal? So that rigid biology teacher, what does that test they have to take look like? And what if they can't do all of it? What is the amount of support they need to be successful? But I want to start from the standard. I want to start from high rather than thinking about my kids can't do any of this, so I'm just going to have to always provide them a simplified text with some pictures and simplified answers. Because sometimes once we come up with an accommodation or a support that we think will help, it's like we're done. Where the idea of shortening the rope is an ever-changing situation, right? I mean, literally question by question in a lesson, I might be thinking, you know what? We did some pronunciation practice of this key vocabulary and I gave them sentence stems, but they just got to talk to a partner. I wonder if I can ask Farhan a question right now and just see what he's got without giving him the stem. And in my experience, over and over and over again, my rate of being able to shorten that rope or move kids toward independent use of skills, whether they're content or language skills, it just gets faster and faster and faster because kids, they feed on success. And most of these kids we're supporting, they haven't been successful in a while. So the second they taste it, they want more of it.
At first, we were thinking about it in terms of almost like a, not to go all Vygotsky, but like zone of proximal development, right? Like, so you've got this rope and were you thinking like you're holding it just a little bit higher than maybe they can reach so they have to jump for it? Or was it something you just lower down so they can grab on, kind of like the rock climber who has someone spotting him?
Right. And I think like lowering that, the idea is that we're lowering it to where they can reach it. I don't have a rope from the top to the bottom that stays there all the time. It's this idea of delivering assistance when it's needed. And when it's not needed, not having it there. Or if the assistance they need right now is a native language text, I'm going to provide that. But I am at the weekly level going to be assessing if I can change what that looks like to move them to more independent use of English.
I'm fascinated by this term that you use in the book. It's called linguistic momentum. And what you just said reminded me of that in terms of, maybe providing a sentence stem, something to get that momentum going and get them in the zone. What is linguistic momentum as you see it? And can you provide some examples of what that looks like in the classroom?
Sure. So when I think of momentum, like you're moving forward with something. And so I put a linguistic in front of it because what we want is students moving forward with language. And in your case, right, the target language would be English. So we're thinking through kids who don't have a lot of skill with English. How do we move them forward quickly with the English language? And honestly, it's scary to not know the language of instruction when you're sitting in a classroom. So all of the affective domain issues, fear, the affective filter being engaged and they don't want to do anything, we've got to find a starting point. And my visual for the linguistic momentum is, the little snowball at the top of the mountain. If I can just get it going, if I can get it started at the top, right, then we're going to get going. So I want to think about what is the easiest entry point for a kid so that they can use language. So one concrete example is a simple sentence stem. A student who has almost no English or very little English, I'm going to provide them the way to get started. I'm opening the door. I'm giving them the first 3 words or the first 5 words of what to say. We're all practicing it. And then I say it like that. That's much easier than me just asking them a question. Another one that I love with kids collaborating with each other for English learners in particular is I put in a protocol at the very beginning of the year where when somebody shares, the next speaker tries to paraphrase what the previous speaker said first. So what I understood was, or what I heard was, right? And there's 2 reasons for that. You see, that puts the second speaker practicing English first in a safe way because the words already came out of somebody else's mouth. And then they can be thinking about their own content. So I would say those are probably 2 of my bread and butter approaches to getting more kids using more English more of the time.
Yeah, I think those are easy entry points for educators too, not terribly complicated, something you can do. I know our teachers like sentence stems a lot in sort of to help, and both of those things you mentioned sort of help reduce that cognitive load of what the kid has to go through to really just get the first answer out and build that momentum. Yeah, thank you. I mean, my experience as a language learner myself, learning Spanish here, sometimes you do get in that zone. And so that idea of linguistic momentum, like if someone just gives you a word. Sometimes you just need that one word and you can keep going.
And another one, especially at secondary, that I think is underutilized is just pronunciation practice. This is years ago, and I don't remember the source, but I was talking with a colleague at one of the districts that I work with, and she said she read a study of secondary English learners, and one of the primary complaints these kids had was, I don't like my accent. I sound different than everybody else, which is not something as an adult educator, it's even on my radar to be thinking about. But if I'm in a history class and we're talking about a totalitarian government, I'm not using that word unless I know how to say it. So right. Where we see a lot of that at elementary, sometimes it falls off by 5th grade, right? But this idea of let's all just say this real quickly. And we're not clapping it out or snapping it out like you do in 1st grade, but we're just giving them a way to get it out of their mouth before I ever expect them to use it with a partner or to answer a question with it.
That strikes me now in terms of just virtual learning. So many times it's hard for our kids just to get our kids to turn their camera on. And so speaking is something similar, like they don't necessarily want everybody hearing their voice. Where do you fall in terms of like choral reading or, something where the teacher, they're following along with the teachers? Is that something you use regularly in your own practice?
I think it's highly appropriate depending on the class, right? But if we're talking about students that are in the earlier proficiency levels of English in a chemistry class, yes, I want them tracking text. I'm giving them a fluent example of how to read it. And maybe depending on the length, the size, the scope of the text, I might read it while they track it. And then we might read it all together. So I think that tracking a proficient oral reading of it or chorally reading it together are both really very appropriate. And the rub with talk, read, talk, write at secondary level is my kids don't want to read it. My kids don't want to talk, right? The motivation piece. So sometimes that's putting that rope down real low at the beginning so you can get an entry point. So they'll start. And then over time, we shorten it where I don't chorally read it all the time. Hey, this time, partner A, you're going to read it to partner B. Tomorrow, B's you're reading to A. You see what I just did there? We started by I did it all. Then we're doing it together. And now it still feels easy to them, right? Partner B's like, I got the day off. But tomorrow he doesn't, So over time, what happens is I say, everybody read this paragraph. Here's your purpose. And they just do. Because we've moved them into that.
I've heard you say a couple of times in a couple of your webinars, you've described yourself as like a control freak extrovert. And so,
accurate.
Yeah. I can relate, right? As a teacher, especially, I think a lot of our teachers can. Giving up that control in the classroom is not easy. So how did you overcome your sort of extroverted control freakishness? And what do you have? What kind of advice do you have for other teachers like me who are also kind of control freaks in that regard?
I'll tell you, the first thing that I had to do was I did a lot of self-reflection, right? Like the old Dr. Phil question, how's that working out for you? Because I felt so convicted about the way I did things. But the reality was I didn't have scores to prove it. You know what I mean? Like me carrying the load in the classroom was not reflecting high achievement on my students' part. And once I said, okay, let me make a change, it kind of freed up for me the pressure of like, but what if this fails? Because it was kind of like, I'm already sort of failing. You know what I mean? So like, I have freedom now to try something that's terrifying, But as far as like the control piece, teachers don't like to hear this, but it's the truth. It's just hard work and takes a lot of planning. I mean, every minute of that, especially the minutes where I'm not talking to my students, I've got to be thoughtful about what's going on. The other piece about that is the talking too much, right? Over talking. I do it all the time. My next book is hopefully coming out next year, and it's all about small teacher moves, like things you can do in 60 seconds or less. Kind of what you were talking about, lowering the cognitive load. And one of the strategies is fewest words possible. But what does that require? I can't be talking in the moment. I have to already think about how I'm going to explain something. Because normally when I'm over talking, it's because I feel like I'm not communicating well. So I make a second attempt at how to say it. I'm not precise. And I would recommend teachers as much as possible record portions of their lessons, especially those lecture pieces, the getting the notes parts. Just watch yourself. You talk a whole lot more than you think you do. I promise you do. And you're going to go, oh my God, why did I need to say that again? I was clear the first time. So that, and then I use a lot of visual cues for myself. Like we talk all the time about visuals for kids, but like my laptop right here, I usually have a bunch of different sticky notes for what I need to remember or say. And then my slide deck probably has twice as many slides as most teachers, because most teachers, they just have 6 slides full of content, right? Mine has a slide full of content, and the next slide says, turn to your partner with the sentence stem. Because if I don't put that there, guess what happens? I talk through it and forget to let them talk.
So you really just literally build it right into the fabric of your lesson.
It's there. And so that when I click, and sometimes, especially if it's something new, I'm not real sure how I'm going to phrase the question, I put blank slides as placeholders. So when I click and I look and I see there's nothing there, it's my visual cue, Nancy, be quiet, think of a question based on the way you just explained that content, and give them a chance to talk or write about it. So whether you have a pre-planned stem or question, or just some sort of a visual placeholder like a blank slide, that's really helped me be more successful in the moment when the train's already moving.
I know as a teacher, I'm going to ask way better questions if I have those questions planned out in advance. Yeah.
For sure.
So, I mean, you heard it here. Advice from Nancy Motley: try something terrifying using the fewest words possible. Right.
There you go.
I'm thinking about resources and the work it would take to plan this kind of lesson and to make Talk, Read, Talk, Write successful in the classroom. You know, because at a high school level, very often there's a void when it comes to relevant resources for English language learners that are interesting, you know, but also on level. You address it in your book. I'm curious to know a little bit more about the actual implementation long term. Like, how do you recommend teachers plan when resources are sometimes scarce?
I actually have a different view than you. I don't really see a void or a scarcity in resources, but it might be because you and I are defining resources differently. And I see this a lot in trainings. So oftentimes the chemistry teacher says, what's the text? What are they reading? The textbook's too hard. So what I would encourage you to be thinking about as you roll this out with your campus is, how are you defining text or the thing they are reading? And the thing they are reading in an English 3 classroom might look like a novel. But I would argue that in 85% of classrooms, the thing they are reading is not a chapter full of printed text. So an already solved calculation in a math classroom with a couple of arrows that have a 1-sentence explanation of what was done at that step is a text. A diagram of the structure and function of cell in biology is absolutely a text. So this idea that I need to hunt for prose in all of my classes is just, that's not at all how I envision resources. So the idea is just thinking through, how can kids engage with the content in a way other than listening to me lecture them? I've actually seen some teachers, my most resistant ones that I work with, here's what I tell them to do. I say, print, you know how you can print out like Google or PowerPoint slides where you have 3 slides and then lines with notes on the side? I say, right, just print that out, the lecture you're going to be giving. And for each one of those slides, write 1 sentence of what you might say when you're lecturing that slide. And instead of delivering the lecture, hand that out to them. That's text.
Right. Yeah.
Teachers know what they're going to say, right? It's almost like scripting the lecture.
I mean, you've said I've read in the book and think you've said before, like sometimes the text replaces the lesson or the mini lesson. Tell me if I'm saying that wrong, but it sounds like kind of what you're mentioning, right? You use the text as the lesson and the supports that you embed in it. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a caveat, that is exactly what a talk, read, talk, write lesson looks like. We engage them in conversation, and the lesson, the learning occurs when they are reading the text. Then they get to collaborate with their peers afterward, and then they're going to write to demonstrate their understanding. Having said that, I do not encourage that every teacher uses talk, read, talk, write in every lesson. We have a purpose, and there are certain standards that I would be better at delivering orally or in another creative way. TRTW is one way to learn, and it is a highly effective way to learn because kids acquire academic language at the same time, but it's not the only way. So I'm not saying you're never allowed to direct teach again. I direct teach all the time.
How often would you say, as you've seen it implemented effectively, how often would a teacher that's using this well use the talk, read, talk, write routine in his or her classroom?
So I think at the secondary level, we're looking at multiple times a week. But the other thing to keep in mind is this process is real malleable. I've seen teachers use talk, read, talk, write to introduce 2 new vocabulary words in the first 10 minutes of a lesson, and then the rest of the period is doing something else. So that's why I call it a routine and not a lesson. Because a routine, it could be 4 minutes, it could be the full 45-minute class period. But
Okay.
in my mind, I would love to see in all classes, kids reading, interpreting, working with a more significant text where the TRTW lesson would look more like close to a full class period, at least once a week. And then maybe one or two other times throughout the week in a more scaled back way. I mean, imagine the power of that if they got that kind of literacy practice 7 periods a day all week long.
Yeah, that's what drew us to the book, really, is the idea that we wanted our learners, all of our learners, not just our English language learners, all of our learners to be engaged more, to be talking more, to be writing more in the classroom. Because you know as well as I do, the only way to get better at a thing is to actually do that thing more. How much native language support do you feel is too much for English language learners, if any?
Exactly 87% of instructional. No, I'm just kidding. There's no like exact number. Here's the thing, you know, that question can often be very polarizing,
Right.
but the reality is at secondary high school campus, if your program model is that language of instruction is English, that is the target language. When I think about native language support, I want to use it strategically to increase the comprehensible input of the target language. So if I have something that's in the native language that's going to help them understand the concepts in English, then that's probably appropriate. The other thing that I think is important for all teachers to hear is if I am a native Spanish speaker and I'm in an English classroom, my brain is a bilingual brain. My brain is not two monolingual brains, right? My colleague, Dr. Lara, explains it to me like this. She says, it doesn't matter how much English I'm learning, because she's a second language learner herself. She says, I am still processing in Spanish. That is where the thinking is going on here. And then I'm processing again to figure out how to get my output in English, right? So we never want to send the message that the native language is not valuable. It is highly valuable. And all of our students who are learning English right now, when they successfully master that, they are more successful in life for being bilingual. But when we're thinking about content that is going to be assessed in English, and our program model's goal is that they're proficient in English, I want to shorten the rope, right? I want to be using as minimal native language support as I can so that they understand the English. If they don't understand any of the English, it's necessary. But every lesson, we want to be thinking about what's that balance.
Yeah, we run into that here a lot at Sharpstown. We have a huge, very recent immigrant population, and they speak all kinds of different languages. It's not just Spanish. I mean, we're getting kids from all over the world. And I literally walked into a classroom one day, gifted teacher. She speaks Farsi, she speaks some Spanish, she speaks English. She literally spoke 3 or 4 different languages in this one classroom, and I was just blown away. But then I thought about it more, and I talked to her about, wow, that must have been really hard. And, how much more of that can we do to support the kids so that you don't have to do that?
And another way to think about this, and, when I taught in A-Leaf, I experienced this. I had a high population of Spanish speakers, but I had 5 or 6 other languages. And at the time, there were 0 resources, right? 0, nothing. And I had to figure out a way to teach the students. So sometimes what happens is if I have the ability as the teacher to use the native language, we just fall way back on that. And that goes where we're enabling our students to not make progress. So like most things in teaching, right? The easiest route isn't always the best route.
Certainly, while native language support is necessary at times, you're right. That rope metaphor, I guess, would be apt in that situation. One of the last things I wanted to touch on was I listened to a webinar you gave on better questions for deeper thinking, and you gave 3 criteria for a good question. The one that struck out to me most was, is it worthy of an answer? We're all guilty, and I know I was guilty as teacher, especially when doing test prep. Is this a question that I would want to answer or dig deeper into as a kid, as a learner? And is it worth my time to answer it? A lot of times we get so caught up in asking questions to try to check for quick understanding that, I'm not sure if we're asking good questions anymore. And so can you give some insight on how teachers can begin to develop questions that matter?
I don't have a perfect answer for this because it's a hard thing to do. First of all, it is challenging. So my number one piece of advice, not every question we ask in class is going to be a rich, relevant, response-worthy question. But if I'm planning for deep discussion after reading. If we're in talk number 2 of a talk, read, talk, write routine, I want it to meet that criteria. So my first piece of advice is don't be an island unto yourself. This is the time to spend collaborating in your PLCs or in your staff meetings about getting in department meetings and saying, okay, Thursday we're doing this text. What's a question kids are going to be driven to answer or compelled to answer about that? So the active collaboration, more heads are better than one. That's the first one. As far as kind of like my hacks, if you will, for getting kids to respond, high school students are very self-centered, and they also love to argue, right?
You're kidding me.
They have opinions about everything.
Right.
So I capitalize on that. So my kind of framework, if you will, or my template is, does my question involve the student? So am I asking them their perspective on something? Am I asking them to put themselves in a certain position? Sometimes that's not possible, but most of the time it is. So I want to put them in the question, because if they're there, they're more likely to talk about it. And then I try to make it opinion-based so that they're getting to agree or disagree with something or have some sort of a choice. And then certainly the last one is as controversial as I can get without breaking any laws or whatever. I want to do that too, because that's the stuff that drives 15-year-olds. So those would probably be my 3 biggest ones: is insert the student, offer choice or agree, disagree kind of questions, and then as compelling or controversial as you can get is better than what is or where is.
And so, yeah, I think my last question, can you give your sort of most concise elevator speech type explanation of what the talk, read, talk, write routine is, and why teachers, not just English teachers, not just language teachers, but why teachers of all contents should use it?
This is the anti-lecture teaching routine. And in this routine, kids are reading, writing, and talking to learn instead of listening to you to learn. My best analogy is it's like riding a bike. You don't learn to ride a bike by watching your older brother do it. You got to be on the bike. And when we teach using TRTW, our kids are on the bike. And then, once they learn how to pedal, right, they can ride wherever they want in life because they have the literacy and the content knowledge from any discipline they're in. That wasn't the fewest words possible, but that's it.
There's still few words, Well, great. Thank you so much for that. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say about your upcoming book or anything else that you wanted to say as before we end.
Well, I'm just excited. I'm finishing I sent the draft off and then COVID hit, right? So now I'm having to revise to make sure that I'm addressing current reality.
Right.
But it's really just all about small moves teachers can make habitual so that they're going to be more effective teachers. And I would look for it this time next year.
Cool. That actually brings up a question that I didn't ask. Like, have there been any adaptations to the talk, read, talk, write routine that you've kind of made or you've seen teachers made? Because they're so really resourceful when things like this happen. Have you seen any adaptations that they've made that you're like, wow, that was really effective?
Oh, tons of stuff. First of all, one thing that's been really great is our English learners are getting much more extended processing time in a virtual environment. So this combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning, they're getting to sit with the reading, for example, longer. They're getting to practice the writing for longer. I've seen teachers use the talk parts, right? Their kids aren't together, so they're using things like Flipgrid or Seesaw. And what I love about that is kids are getting more practice. Like my 15-year-old, she cares what she looks like. So she'll do her answer in her Flipgrid and not like the way her makeup looks. She'll go do her makeup and then record it again. So she might practice her academic response 5 times. And there's value in that. Are we missing some of the face-to-face interaction? Yes. But there's other values that are kind of replacing some of the things that are missing. The only other thing that I would add to that is, I'm not sure they've always existed, but they've certainly gotten a lot better. The virtual resources that are out there, things like Text and Levels, Common Lit, Ed Puzzle, where we can assign a text and differentiate it by lexile level. I can have it read aloud to students. I can chunk the assignment so that they have to answer a basic comprehension question before they move on to the next one. And I think all of those things are serving our English learners really, really well, even when we're not face-to-face.
Yeah. And just looking at it from not a deficit model, but from, what it can do to strengthen. So
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot. I'm really looking forward to sharing this with our staff, with our broader Sharpstown community, our district community. And I think it's going to be a great asset. Thank you so much.
Awesome.